Good morning, everyone. David Zimmerman here from Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Sorry I can't be with you today. I was looking forward to seeing Pensacola. I can see the mountains in Washington State from my bedroom window, but that's as close as we Canadians are allowed to get to the USA at this moment, with the borders still closed. So I've done a virtual Zoom recording of my lecture, and let's get going. So my lecture is about West Coast defense, the defense of the Canadian West Coast. And it's entitled, "For the Want of a Single Gun, the West Coast Will Be Lost, the Defense of Canada's Pacific Waters in the Early Cold War." In the summer of 1951, Rear Admiral W.B. Creary, the flag officer Pacific Coast, requested the Canadian Army to provide a single coast artillery gun at York Island. It was considered to be key to the entire scheme for the maritime defense of the West Coast. This picture shows a coast defense battery at York Island, but in the Second World War. By the early 1950s, all that remained were the concrete of the gun emplacements. All Army ordnance and personnel had long since been withdrawn. York Island is located here at the very beginning of the Straits of the Strait of Georgia, which is the northern approaches into Vancouver. The other major strait I'll be talking about, this is Vancouver Island here. This is Washington State down here. And this is the Strait of Juan de Fuca here. Where I am today is located right about here. So York Island guarded the northern approaches into Vancouver, and it was considered to be a key issue. The Johnstone Straits, which separate Vancouver Island from the mainland of British Columbia, are at its narrowest point at York Island. And it was believed that having some sort of indicator loop, which was devised to pick up the magnetic signatures of ships passing over it, and a gun battery to stop any ships passing without authorization, would be key to the northern defense of the west coast of Canada. The York Island debate marked the end of a long tradition of coast defense role for the Army. The York Island debate actually went on between 1951 and 1954. The Army refused to provide a single gun for York Island, and this was made clear when the debate ended with the Army's point-blank refusal to aid the Navy in coastal defense, when General Guy Simmons, the chairman of the Chiefs of Staff of the Canadian Army, made it very clear that the Canadian Army no longer considered coast defense to be its role. And this was quite a substantial development, because the Army's traditional primary role had always been coast defenses. Not fighting in Europe, not fighting overseas with allies, not in an alliance with allies, which of course existed by the late 1940s with NATO, but the Army was making it clear it did not see its role any further, given the shift in technology to be providing for the coast defenses of Canada. The Navy's response was outrage. One naval captain said the Army is shirking its responsibilities. "We had to deal," he said, "with recognizing a threat in wartime is the attempted introduction into Canadian and US ports," and I find this interesting, "by surface craft or weapons of mass destructions." Excuse me. and saboteurs or agents, especially in the early stages of the war. So the Canadian Navy had identified the potential threat, the largest threat in the early 1950s to the West Coast was Soviet ships smuggling into near West Coast ports weapons of mass destruction that could be detonated at the beginning of hostilities. On this, I should point out, this is the Esquimalt Naval Base. Esquimalt is basically the harbor down from Victoria. Victoria is located right there. That's the entrance to Victoria Harbor. This is Esquimalt Harbor here. The naval base is here. The Army withdrawal from coastal defense was very clear, and this is what the Army left behind at the coastal defenses around Victoria and Esquimalt after the Second World War. This is a 6-inch disappearing gun, which has just been left unceremoniously sitting on the ground. As a result of this, the Army, as I've already said, ended its traditional role of defending Canada's coast. And what this debate reveals, the real state or the complete lack of any defenses of British Columbia and therefore in large measure Washington State and to a certain extent Alaska, caused by complete absence of any effective defenses provided by the Canadian military on the West Coast. Now, the historiography of the post-war Navy has really been very limited. In fact, we believe, most historians have believed until I wrote my book, Maritime Command Pacific, that the only collective security response in the Cold War was by air through NORAD. And there's a quote from a historian by the name of James Ferguson, which is, I point out, is completely wrong. We're still waiting for the official history of the Canadian Navy this period to come out. My book was a part of a sub-study for this official history. And there's my book, Maritime Command Pacific. It's still available on print. I think UBC Press has sold 75 copies. So if you buy, just 7 of you buy, you'll increase my sales exponentially. In the immediate post-war period, the Royal Canadian Navy went through a traumatic decline. At its peak, in the end of 1944, the Royal Canadian Navy had grown to the 3rd largest navy in the world, with 450 ships in commission. By 1946, only 10 ships remained in service, 2 light cruisers, a few destroyers, frigates, and minesweepers. Most ships had inadequate crews, and their principal duty was training a new generation of sailors, since all the wartime sailors had been very quickly demobilized and sent home. The Navy's primary goal was to acquire, it hoped, 2 ex-Royal Naval aircraft carriers. And they hoped to have a fleet evenly divided between the Atlantic and the Pacific, between Halifax and Esquimalt. NATO, however's formation in 1949 changed the direction of Canadian defense planning. The Canadian Navy never was able to get government funding to acquire 2 aircraft carriers. And the commitment of the Canadian government to join a collective security of Western Europe led the RCN to commit all of its available resources to the Atlantic. It was to supply its single aircraft carrier, 24 ocean escorts on D-Day, the beginning of any war with the Soviets, and they would be ready to shepherd convoys of troops across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the Canadian Navy didn't have anything like 24 ocean escorts in the early 1950s. In fact, when the Korean War began, there were a total of 3 Canadian warships vaguely ready for operations, 3 destroyers, all based in Esquimalt, supplemented with drafts of crews from the Atlantic coast from Halifax. Those ships sailed very quickly to join the UN's forces in Korea. But the RCN couldn't possibly meet any of these commitments. But there was an ongoing and growing Soviet threat in the Pacific. In the 1950s, a US-Canadian intelligence estimate put the Soviet Pacific Fleet as having 50 ocean patrol and 45 coastal submarines. Soviets, it was believed, could keep up to 23 submarines on patrol, attacking shipping, mining approaches to ports, etc. This document also speculated the Soviets might attempt to take islands in the Aleutians. Post-war strategic plans of the Navy on the coast were determined by the ABC agreement signed by Canada and the United States going back to the Second World War, ABC 22. After the war, Canada and the United States set up a committee called the Military Cooperation Committee in 1946. And in 1948, it came up with the first joint post-war plan. This plan was altered and improved in the years ahead. And in 1949, MCC 300/1, lovely names, the Emergency Defense Plan for North America, was approved by both governments. On the West Coast, in order to implement this agreement, the Canadian military, particularly the Navy, joined with the United States Navy in signing what became known as the Alcanus Agreements. And the Alcanus Agreements committed Canada to joining the United States into collective security for the West Coast outside of the umbrella of NATO. The Americans and the Canadian commands crudely linked together their separate pre-existing emergency plans. And it was only in 1951 that a plan emerged to coordinate fully Canadian and US responses. The problem was for the RCN that none of its major fleet units, right down to minesweepers, were really committed to the West Coast in times of war. In fact, what the RCN expected to have happen was every ship that was based in Esquimalt on the first day of a conflict with the Soviets would be to leave Esquimalt Harbor, head to the Panama Canal, into the Caribbean, and then hence to the Pacific. The only ship to be left behind was one small patrol vessel, illustrated here, PTC 724, a ship so small they didn't even have a name for it. Harbor defenses involved laying anti-submarine nets at Esquimalt and Prince Rupert, the only other naval base on the West Coast, located further up the north coast of British Columbia. There would be 2 minesweepers provided from reserve forces, and that was basically it for the entire West Coast defense commitment. But Canada had a huge area of responsibilities. And this is the Alcanus agreed maritime defense area Canada was responsible for, all the way up to Alaska, basically a line drawn from the western end of the Straits of Juan de Fuca, all the way up the coast, including large areas of Alaska. And despite the commander of the Pacific Coast, Harry DeWolf, in 1950, the RCN refused to give him one single ship to provide for this defense in times of war. Every ship was going to the Atlantic. This lack of commitments did not go unnoticed by the Americans. Lieutenant General A.C. Wedemeyer, who's responsible for the U.S. Army's planning for the defense of the West Coast, pointed this out, that Canadians had signed agreements, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but had signed agreements basically without making any commitment to forces. In response to Wedemeier's criticism, a staff officer in Ottawa, a lieutenant by the name of H.G.J. Walls, said, regardless of how plans are made, we cannot grow ships on trees. Therefore, we cannot make a reply to the U.S. General's concerns. He said, well, there's nothing to say to this because, yes, he's right, but we simply don't have enough ships to respond to all of our commitments. And the only commitment we're going to even try to vaguely fill is our commitment to NATO. All these agreements we signed for the West Coast defense, we're simply not going to honor. We're simply not going to honor. Well, the minister of National Defense, Brooke Claxton, who's illustrated here, approved the signing of the Alcanis Agreement of 1951. But he said the minister, but he gave it, he informed his staff to inform the Canadian Navy that the minister has instructed that Canadian planners, particularly when drawing up plans with other nations, must not agree to a plan which requires more forces to implement than those which the Canadian government has already authorized in the service phase build-up program. So basically, what Brooks said is, you can't agree to provide ships which we don't have. So the West Coast remained defenseless. But there was serious security concerns on the West Coast. Concerns of submarine attacks, concern of surface raiders attacking shipping. At least 15 ocean-going ships, Soviet submarines, could be located off the west coast of Canada at the beginning of a war. Long-range attacks on ports using missiles from Soviet submarines were a distinct possibility. And the assumption was, in fact, that Esquimalt and other Canadian targets and American West Coast targets would be destroyed in the opening days of any atomic exchange. There might even be attacks by raiding parties to harass West Coast defenders. So how do you defend the West Coast without ships? Admiral Creary, pictured here with the king and queen, said, how do you do it? Well, this is where York Island became key. If we conceal the northern approaches at York Island, then we can stop one principal zone of attack. Now, providing passive defenses in the Straits of Juan de Fuca, the other major entry point into the Puget Sound, into the port of Vancouver, et cetera, would be far more difficult. The Canadian Navy, the only answer they could have was to lay a minefield across the Straits of Juan de Fuca. Unfortunately, laying a minefield across the Straits of Juan de Fuca was impossible. It would have taken 98,000 mines, cost of $25 million. And because of the tides and the currents, it was simply not possible to protect the straits using mines from submarines. The minefield simply could not work. So here was the catch-22. Naval Service Headquarters in Ottawa would not allocate ships to defend the West Coast, but technical experts had debunked any sort of passive defenses, and the Army had refused to provide defenses at York Island. And in May 1951, Creary demanded Ottawa provide more ships, but the naval staff absolutely adamantly refused. No ships, no West Coast defense, not even a single gun. So from 1945 to 1957, there was no defenses to protect the coast of British Columbia. Canada failed to live up its commitments to the USA for Pacific Ocean maritime security. Canadian military planners had a Eurocentric view of the world. And as a result, RCN units based at Esquimalt, what were they expected to do? As soon as war was declared, as I said, they would leave and head towards the Panama Canal. However, the changing threat and new resources, which opened up in the late 1950s, the emergence of a nuclear first strike capable submarines firing missiles such as these surface-launched nuclear equipped cruise missiles, as well as the great expansion of the Royal Canadian Navy that took place in the 1950s, particularly the delivery of a large number of its new anti-submarine vessels, such as this HMCS Saint Laurent, provided a new view of the nature of war. In the late 1950s and 1957, Maritime Command Pacific was established, which joined Royal Canadian Air Force maritime patrol squadrons with the Navy. At that time, the Navy suddenly realized the futility of sending ships from the Pacific to the Atlantic. If it was going to be an atomic war, the war would be over before any ships got to the Panama Canal, let alone into the Atlantic. In 1957, the Navy agreed there would be defenses for the West Coast. The period of a defenseless West Coast came to an end. Thank you very much.